He lost everything in one night. Family, power, legacy. But fate gave him one thing back. A heartbeat. And with that heartbeat, Davil Sirate is rebuilding himself into the deadliest force the city has ever seen. Davil Sirate had built his empire on a foundation that mixed fear with respect. In Eastbridge City, his name was like a shadow stretching across every alley, every warehouse, every backroom where deals were made behind closed doors. For years, his leadership kept the criminal world from collapsing into chaos. Rivals were controlled, partners were managed, and enemies were discouraged long before they ever became a threat. The Sirate Mansion, standing high above the harbor, was the heart of this empire. Inside its thick walls lived not just a crime boss, but a man who believed in structure and loyalty. His brother Lucas handled finances with an accuracy that people envied. His cousin Elena oversaw intelligence networks that brought information before problems even surfaced. Everything worked like a precise machine, smooth, efficient, unbreakable. Or so Davil believed. Because in every empire, there exists someone who refuses to stay in the shadows. In Davil's world, that person was Marcus Dre. Marcus had crawled out of the same streets, but instead of building order, he nurtured chaos. His gang thrived on blood, kidnappings, sudden attacks, and a kind of violence that served no purpose except to show power. For years, Marcus kept his distance, partly because Davil was stronger, partly because direct confrontation would mean suicide. But time changes men, and ambition turns into poison. It began on a night that seemed too ordinary for the destruction that was coming. The guard were on routine shifts. The atmosphere in the mansion was calm. Sirate men had celebrated a successful week of operations. Some guards were relaxed, others tired, and security checks were carried out with less tension than usual. No one noticed the early signs of the storm. The first move from Marcus wasn't loud. It came disguised as silence. A parked van at the corner of the street. Cameras blinking out one by one. Communication lines flickering before collapsing. Guard posts becoming strangely quiet. Everything was subtle, coordinated, and spread out enough that it didn't trigger immediate alarm. By the time Davil's men realized something was wrong, the enemy was already inside the gates. Then the real attack began. Armed men surged onto the property like a wave of darkness. They moved fast, cutting down guards before alarms could properly sound. Suppressed gunfire echoed through the grounds. Bodies fell quietly into the grass. The enemy seemed endless, pouring in from different directions, each one knowing exactly where to go. Moments later, the eastern wing of the mansion was consumed by fire. Flames rose high, bright enough to illuminate terrified faces and shadows running through hallways. Smoke crawled along ceilings and dipped into corridors. Rooms that once held memories became blazing traps. The mansion structure shook under the heat as fire wrapped itself around wood, metal, and stone. For the first time in years, Davil Sirate felt his empire slipping away. His men tried to defend the home, but the attack was too sudden, too large. Marcus's army seemed prepared for every response. Attempted escape routes were blocked. Reinforcements never arrived. Communications were dead. Davil moved through the mansion with fierce determination, but even he could not stop the collapse happening around him. Lucas attempted to lead a group of people toward a back exit. They never made it. The attackers were waiting, as if they knew the plan before it was made. Explosions tore through the hallway, and Lucas died in the same place he had once helped design the family's escape strategies. Davil didn't even have time to grieve. He saw Elena from across a corridor for a brief moment. Smoke behind her, fire spreading around her, enemies approaching from both sides. She tried to fight her way through, but disappeared in a burst of flames and gunfire. Davil could not reach her. He could not reach anyone. The house that had once been the symbol of his control was now nothing but a battlefield. Eventually, Davil found himself alone, pushing through collapsing doorways and smoke-filled paths. His face was streaked with sweat, ash, and blood. The heat scorched his skin, but he kept moving. Each turn brought him to another dead end, another body, another reminder that Marcus Dre had planned this attack to perfection. He tried to escape through a long hallway leading toward the service exit, but before he reached the final door, shadows emerged. Marcus's men, armed and waiting. There was no warning, no word exchanged, only swift, brutal violence. They beat him until his vision blurred and his legs collapsed. They dragged him across the burning estate like a trophy. The mansion behind him crumbled in fire, taking his family, allies, and entire history with it. He was thrown into a truck with no care for the blood pooling beneath him. The vehicle moved away from the flaming estate, bumping across rough terrain. The city lights faded behind him, replaced by the cold emptiness of the outskirts. They were taking him somewhere he would not be found, or so they believed. At the edge of a deep ravine, the attackers stopped. They pulled him out and looked at him not as a feared boss, but as a broken object ready to be discarded. Without ceremony, without hesitation, they threw him over the edge. The world became a blur of falling, crashing, and tearing pain. When Davil hit the ground, something inside him shattered. For a long time, he did not move. The forest around him whispered with night sounds, indifferent to his suffering. The sky above held no comfort. The cold air wrapped around him like a silent death sentence. He should have died. But Davil Sirate's story did not end there. A faint spark inside him refused to extinguish. His fingers twitched first, then his arms dragged through the dirt. Pain screamed through every bone, but he clawed at the earth anyway. Inch by inch, breath by breath, he crawled. The ravine walls were steep, but he grabbed onto roots, branches, rocks, anything that kept him from sliding backward. Blood loss blurred his vision. Exhaustion tried to drown him. Memories of fire, screams, and loss weighed on him like chains. But something stronger pulled him forward. By the time he reached the top, he collapsed into the grass, gasping, shaking, and half-conscious. The forest stretched before him, dark, cold, and unforgiving. But it was also the only place untouched by Marcus Dre's reach. The Davil Sirate who ruled Eastbridge was gone. What remained was a broken man, lying on the edge of a forest, stripped of everything except one burning truth. He was still alive, and if he was alive, then Marcus Dre's victory was incomplete. Slowly, painfully, Davil pushed himself to his feet. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows. It promised hardship, hunger, isolation, but it also promised a place to rebuild, to disappear, and to rise again. With the last of his strength, Davil stepped into the trees. The forest closed around him. A new Davil Sirate would be born here. The forest accepted Davil Sirate with the cold indifference of nature. The moment he stepped beneath the canopy, the world behind him, the burning mansion, the screams, the betrayal, the fall, faded into distant echoes. Here, in the wilderness far removed from Eastbridge's poisonous lights, nothing cared about his name, his empire, or the power he once commanded. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches woven like the architecture of a forgotten world. The ground beneath his feet was uneven and unforgiving. Every sound was unfamiliar, and every shadow carried a silent threat. His journey deeper into the forest began not with purpose, but with survival. His injuries were severe, bruised ribs, cuts along his arms, dried blood across his face, and a sharp pain in his right leg that throbbed with every step. His breaths were short and ragged, each one scraping through his lungs like broken glass. He had no food, no water, no shelter, and no certainty of seeing another sunrise. Yet something within him pushed forward relentlessly. For the first hour, he walked without thought. The forest guided him only because turning back meant death. Fallen leaves muffled his footsteps. The branches overhead blocked out the moonlight, casting irregular patches of darkness across his path. Now and then, distant calls of night creatures pierced the silence, reminding him that he was no longer in a world shaped by humans. Predators existed here, hidden in the undergrowth, measuring him with instincts sharper than any weapon. Eventually, his strength collapsed, forcing him to rest beside an old tree with a trunk thick enough to shield him from the wind. He slid down against it, gasping as pain surged through his ribs. For a moment, he closed his eyes, expecting the heaviness in his body to pull him into unconsciousness. But the images behind his eyelids were worse than the darkness around him. He saw the mansion burning. He saw Lucas falling. He saw Elena trapped by the flames. He saw everything Marcus Dre had taken. His chest tightened with grief, but grief slowly transformed into something far more powerful. Hatred rose like a fire that could not be extinguished, turning the weakness in his limbs into a trembling determination. He could not die here. Not yet. Not while Marcus still breathed. With a slow, deliberate movement, Davil forced himself back to his feet. The night continued to grow colder, and the forest thickened as he moved deeper. Finding water became a priority, dictated by instinct rather than thought. He listened carefully, filtering through the rustling of leaves, until he heard the faint trickle of movement, a stream hiding somewhere beyond a wall of bushes. Following the sound, he found a narrow creek cutting through the forest, its surface reflecting slivers of moonlight. He knelt beside it, cupped his hands, and drank greedily despite the pain in his arms. The water was icy, but it revived him more than anything else could have. Hours passed in slow struggle. At one point, he stumbled upon a small clearing surrounded by birch trees. Their pale trunks shone like silent guardians under the moon's glow. The ground was soft here, carpeted with moss and scattered leaves, offering a place more forgiving than any he'd seen since escaping the ravine. Exhaustion finally overtook him, and his body collapsed onto the forest floor. Sleep came in waves, fitful, shallow, interrupted by shivers and nightmares. When dawn broke, it was announced not by warmth but by a dull silver light pressing through the branches above. Davil awoke with stiff limbs and a dry throat. His wounds ached, but something subtle had changed. The man who had entered the forest last night was broken, defeated, drowning in grief. The man waking now still carried all that pain, but also a growing instinct to survive. The first day was spent learning the forest patterns. Davil moved carefully, testing his balance, forcing his injured leg to adapt to the terrain. He explored the area around the clearing, discovering edible berries, though he tasted them cautiously. Hunger made his choices desperate, but he would not risk sickness. He gathered dry branches and leaves, piecing together a crude shelter against the base of fallen log. Each task was slow and clumsy, yet he persisted with a patience he had rarely shown in his former life. By afternoon, fatigue pushed him to rest again, but his mind refused to settle. Instead, he reflected on the man he had been, a leader who commanded fear, a strategist who anticipated every move, a protector who believed loyalty would shield his family. That belief had cost him dearly. Marcus Dre exploited the very trust Davil placed in order, and the result was a massacre that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But if Marcus expected Davil to die quietly in a forest, he had miscalculated. As the sun descended, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold, Davil sought tools. He found a long, sturdy branch that could serve as a walking stick. He sharpened its end using the jagged edge of a broken rock he discovered near the creek. The process took time, but by nightfall, he had something resembling a weapon. Primitive, yes, but in the forest, even a simple tool could mean the difference between life and death. The second night was harder than the first. Winds rattled the branches above his shelter. The forest was alive with unsettling noises, distant howls, the rustle of predators hunting unseen prey, the snap of twigs that seemed too close for comfort. Sleep eluded him. He lay awake, tracing patterns in the shadows, clutching the sharpened stick across his chest. The cold seeped into his bones. His muscles twitched from strain. Pain pulsed through every old wound, reminding him that he was not yet healed. But despite all this, he did not feel defeated. Each challenge hardened him. Each hour strengthened the resolve simmering beneath his skin. On the morning of the second day, he began to train. It started with small movements, breathing exercises to steady his chest, stretches to loosen aching muscles. He used trees as makeshift supports to strengthen his injured leg. He practiced walking silently on uneven ground, mimicking the hunting patterns of animals he had watched the previous day. His body protested every motion, but he forced it forward. Pain became a constant companion, but not an enemy. It was a reminder of what he needed to overcome. As the days passed, Davil adapted to the forest like a creature born from its shadows. He grew faster, more precise, more alert. He learned to track small animals, to recognize edible plants, and to move through the undergrowth without making a sound. He sharpened stones into primitive blades. He climbed trees to survey the land and anticipate weather shifts. He strengthened his arms by lifting fallen logs, his legs by running short distances through dense brush. Each night, he slept a little better, his strength growing piece by piece. His mind sharpened alongside his body. He replayed the night of the attack over and over, studying it with the same cold logic he once used for planning operations. He analyzed Marcus Dre's strategy, how he infiltrated the mansion, how he cut communication, how he outnumbered the guards. Every observation carved a new scar in his memory, but also built the blueprint of future vengeance. He realized something important in those quiet forest hours. Marcus had not simply wanted him dead. Marcus wanted his legacy erased. That ambition would become Marcus's downfall. One evening, as Davil stood near the top of a low ridge watching the sun sink behind the trees, a fierce clarity settled inside him. He was no longer the man who crawled out of a ravine, broken and bleeding. He was no longer the leader who lived behind luxury walls, softened by routine and comfort. The forest had stripped him down, cut him open, and rebuilt him with raw instinct and unyielding purpose. He had been a ruler before. Now, he was something else, something sharper, harder, more resilient. Davil Sirate would rise again, not as the man Marcus tried to kill, but as the force Marcus could never hope to control. And when he returned to Eastbridge, it would not be quietly. It would be as a storm carrying the vengeance of everything he had lost. Weeks blurred into each other, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of survival. The forest had become Davil Sirate's world, and within that harsh world, he shaped himself into something new. His wounds had closed into scars. His body, once softened by comfort and command, had hardened under constant strain. Muscles developed where weakness had lived before. His senses sharpened. He could distinguish between the crack of a dry branch under a small animal's weight and the heavier pressure of something larger, more dangerous. Hunger, cold, and pain remained constant companions, but they no longer controlled him. They were simply conditions of existence. As his strength grew, his movements evolved from survival patterns into deliberate training. He ran through the forest in controlled bursts, forcing his lungs to adapt, his heart to endure. He used tree trunks to practice striking, his fists and forearms toughening with each impact. He threw sharpened sticks at distant points, improving his accuracy until he could consistently hit small targets from a distance. He climbed, crawled, rolled, and improvised exercises that mimicked the chaos of combat. Every bruise he earned now was a choice, not an injury inflicted by an enemy. But strength alone would not be enough. Vengeance required more than muscles and rage. It demanded information, planning, and precise timing. One morning, as he stood at the edge of a high slope overlooking a narrow, distant road, he understood that the forest had given him all it could. The next phase would not be survived in isolation. He needed to see what had become of Eastbridge. The decision to leave the forest did not come suddenly. It formed slowly, layer by layer, until it felt inevitable. The man who had crawled into the trees was broken. The man who walked out had a purpose that reached beyond survival. There was no benefit in staying hidden forever. Marcus Dre believed Davil was dead. That false certainty was Davil's greatest advantage, and time would only erode it if he waited too long. On a gray morning heavy with mist, Davil stood at the edge of the forest where the trees began to thin. Beyond the last line of branches lay rough, open land that eventually bled into the outskirts of the city. He looked back only once, not with sentiment, but with a measuring gaze. The forest had burned weakness out of him like fire. It had broken him and rebuilt him, but it was never meant to be his final home. He stepped out from the cover of the trees and began the long walk back toward the world that had tried to bury him. The landscape changed gradually. Wild earth gave way to patches of neglected farmland, then to abandoned lots where rusted fences leaned at crooked angles. Cracked asphalt appeared in strips, hinting at old roads no longer cared for. The air carried faint traces of oil, smoke, and distant engines, the familiar scent of human territory. He moved cautiously, understanding that while the forest had dulled his social instincts, the city had not dulled its appetite for danger. By the time he reached the outer fringes of Eastbridge, the sun had dipped low, throwing long shadows across empty streets and worn brick buildings. This was not the polished center where money changed hands in clean offices. This was the forgotten borderland where people survived unseen, and where men like Marcus often recruited desperate faces into violent causes. Davil kept to alleyways and blind corners, avoiding open areas. His appearance had changed so dramatically that no one who saw him would recognize the former crime boss. His beard was rough and untrimmed, his hair longer, his clothes torn and marked by forest life. To a passerby, he would look like any other drifter. That anonymity served him well. He needed information first. In the days that followed, Davil moved like a ghost through the outskirts. He watched and listened from the edges of markets, from doorways, from stairwells where shadows gathered. He studied the markings on walls, the graffiti that signaled gang territories. He noted which corners were patrolled by which men, how they dressed, how they moved, how confident they seemed. Eastbridge spoke its own language, and he had not forgotten how to read it. Soon, patterns emerged. Marcus Dre's presence had spread like a stain. Areas once associated with the Sirate influence now carried symbols and signs linked to Marcus's gang. The men standing guard were bolder, louder, less disciplined than Davil's former crew, but their numbers were impossible to ignore. The city had shifted in Marcus's favor. The vacuum left by Davil's supposed death had been filled quickly. The story of Davil Sirate's demise floated through the air in different forms, carried in half-whispered comments and careless boasts. Some claimed he had burned in his mansion. Others said his body had been thrown into the sea. A few suggested that even if he had survived, he would never dare show his face again. Hearing these tales gave Davil exactly what he needed: confirmation that the lie of his death had rooted itself deeply. At night, he retreated to the derelict corners of the city, sleeping in abandoned buildings or under broken staircases. He used what little he could find or salvage, turning scraps into tools and old pipes into makeshift weapons. He watched the gang's routines from a distance, tracking when their vehicles arrived, where they parked, how often they rotated shifts at certain posts. He studied faces, learning who held authority and who simply followed orders. His mind returned fully to the role it knew best: strategist. He realized quickly that a direct assault on Marcus's operation would be suicide. The gang now held too much ground, too many men, too many connections. But large structures were not destroyed from the outside. They crumbled when their foundations were removed. Davil understood that to reenact the night of his own fall in reverse, he would have to be patient. He would have to dismantle Marcus not with a single strike, but with a series of precise cuts. Before he could begin, he needed one more thing: confirmation that Marcus Dre was still truly in control. He made his way closer to the central zones where Marcus's power was most concentrated. These were streets patrolled more frequently, lit by crude lights salvaged and wired to flicker all night. The men here walked with a false sense of invincibility, laughing loudly, waving their weapons openly, certain that no one would dare challenge them. From the rooftop of an old warehouse, Davil watched as a black vehicle rolled into a courtyard one evening. Men gathered around it with a tense respect that distinguished this moment from all others. The doors opened, and a familiar figure emerged. Time had changed Marcus Dre, adding weight to his frame and carving deeper lines into his expression, but the arrogance in his posture was the same. He walked as if the city belonged to him now. Davil watched him closely, studying every detail. The way his men moved around him, the way he gestured, the way they responded. Marcus had not only survived, he had flourished on the ashes of Davil's destruction. The sight did not break Davil's resolve. It sharpened it. He finally saw, with his own eyes, the man who believed he had won. In that quiet, hidden moment on the roof, Davil made an unspoken promise. Not to the city, not to the past, but to himself. He would not rush. He would not make the mistake of charging blindly into the fire. He would do to Marcus what Marcus had done to him. He would learn his defenses. He would find his weaknesses. He would take his people, his money, his security, and his confidence, piece by piece. The first step in that long process would not be grand. It would be nearly invisible. Davil began to mark locations, safe houses, supply routes, collections points where Marcus's men gathered to move cash, weapons, and information. He noticed which men were careless, which ones drank too much, which ones took unnecessary risks with their routines. The ones who strayed from their groups became important recordings in his mental ledger. He would start at the edges, like rot beneath polished wood, feeding on the unnoticed parts until the entire structure weakened. As the days turned into nights and back again, Davil's two worlds merged. The discipline of the forest remained within him, shaping how he moved through the streets. He avoided attention by standing still when others rushed, by disappearing when noise gathered, by becoming just another shape in the background. He walked with the patience of a hunter who had already lived through his own death. The man who had once ruled Eastbridge from a mansion now operated from alleys and rooftops. Yet, in a quiet, absolute way, he had never felt more dangerous. Marcus Dre held the city, but Davil Sirate had something more powerful than territory. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most lethal man still breathing in Eastbridge. Davil Sirate understood that revenge was not a single moment. It was a sequence, a chain of cause and effect that, if shaped carefully, could bring even the strongest enemy to their knees. The night he watched Marcus Dre step out of the black vehicle, surrounded by loyal men, something settled into place in Davil's mind. The target was real. The threat was alive. The war had officially begun. He did not strike the next night, or the night after that. Instead, he observed, from rooftops, alley corners, and shadowed windows. He watched the way Marcus's network pulsed. There were collection runs moving cash from small neighborhood spots to larger safe houses. There were couriers carrying packages whose importance could be guessed by the number of men assigned to guard them. There were side streets used repeatedly by the same vehicles, patterns so predictable that only arrogance could explain their looseness. Davil knew that Marcus's strength, like his own once had been, depended on three pillars: men, money, and fear. To break the empire, all three would have to be attacked, quietly at first, then more boldly. The first cut needed to be small, almost invisible, something that Marcus's gang could mistake for coincidence, bad luck, or the random violence of the city. If they suspected a calculated hand behind the damage, the advantage of Davil's assumed death would be weakened. He started with a man named Rico, though Davil did not yet know his name. He only knew that this man was careless. Rico operated near the edge of Marcus's territory, in a neighborhood that clung to survival with worn houses and flickering lights. He was responsible for collecting payments from frightened shopkeepers and handing the money off at a nearby checkpoint every few nights. Unlike others, he often walked alone for part of the route, distracted by his own overconfidence. He lingered too long outside certain places, smoked more than he should, and occasionally took shortcuts through alleys that were darker and emptier than common sense allowed. Davil watched him for days. He mapped his schedule, his habits, the way he adjusted his jacket when carrying more money than usual. He memorized every alley the man used, every corner where he paused, every door he leaned against when he thought no one was watching. The familiarity of this process felt almost comforting. Planning had always been Davil's strength. The forest had sharpened his instincts, but strategy had always lived in him. When the time felt right, Davil chose a night heavy with fog. The streetlights glowed in dull halos, unable to cut through the thick air. Noise was muted, as if the city itself were holding its breath. From the roof of an abandoned building, Davil watched Rico make his rounds. Everything followed the pattern he expected. The visits, the exchanges, the casual swagger of a man who believed the streets belonged to him. As Rico finished his final stop and turned into his usual alley, Davil moved. His steps were silent, measured, informed by nights spent navigating the forest floor. He took a path that would put him ahead of the collector, slipping through back entrances and climbing down a rusted fire escape. In the narrow alley, shadows clung to the walls like a second layer of paint. The faint sound of Rico's footsteps echoed behind him, growing gradually louder. Davil waited in the deeper darkness between two dumpsters, his breathing slow, his body still, his hands curled around the length of metal pipe he had repurposed as a weapon. It was not elegant, but it was effective, and for now that was enough. When Rico came close, the moment stretched. There were no words exchanged, no warnings, no announcements of identity or purpose. The strike was quick, controlled, and precise. The pipe connected with the back of Rico's leg, sending him to the ground. Another blow left him limp and unconscious before he could fully understand what was happening. The entire scene took only a handful of heartbeats. Davil crouched beside the fallen man and searched him swiftly. He found the cash, stacks of crumpled notes wrapped in rubber bands, along with a simple pistol and a cheap phone. The money disappeared into Davil's warm bag. The phone he studied for a second, then left where it was, knowing its inactivity would raise questions later. He dragged Rico's body deeper into the alley, hiding him behind trash containers and old crates. The man was alive, barely, his shallow breathing proof that Davil had not come here to indulge in unnecessary cruelty. The point had not been to kill him. The point had been to remove what he carried. Davil left the alley as quietly as he had entered it. By the time Marcus's men realized that a regular payment had gone missing and that one of their collectors had been found injured and confused, the night had already passed. Speculation would follow. Maybe they would suspect a rival gang. Maybe they would blame a random mugging. They would be angry, but not yet alarmed. That was the level of damage Davil wanted for a first step. The second cut came days later, directed not at the money, but at the flow of weapons. Somewhere between Marcus's inner circle and the men on the street, guns had to move. Davil tracked a particular van that followed a repeating pattern, leaving an old industrial district at night, stopping at 3 or 4 spots, then returning near dawn. The men who traveled with the van were disciplined, more alert than the likes of Rico, which made them dangerous but also predictable. He followed them from a distance, never revealing himself, watching from high vantage points. The van always stopped for a short time at a warehouse near the river, a place where the traffic of illegal goods was almost invisible under the cover of legitimate transport. Men would unload crates and carry them inside. None of those crates ever returned to the vehicle. Davil understood the implications. He did not yet have the resources to attack the warehouse directly, but he could send a message along the route. He identified a stretch of road where the van had to slow down due to damaged asphalt and an old pothole. The area was lightly patrolled. Street lamps there flickered or stayed dark. The surrounding buildings were either abandoned or occupied by people too careful to look out of their windows. On a night of thin rain, Davil set up his plan. He moved debris into the road, broken bricks, a wooden pallet, small metal scraps, enough to force the van to slow down even more than usual. He positioned himself along a wall, hidden behind a collapsed metal gate. In his hand was a chain he had pulled from a discarded motorbike, wrapped for grip. His body was steady. His mind was calm. When the van approached, its headlights carved through the drizzle. As Davil had predicted, it slowed, then slowed further as the driver spotted the obstacles in front. The vehicle rolled past his hiding place at reduced speed. Davil surged forward, swung the chain, and shattered one of the side mirrors in a quick, fluid motion. The sound of breaking glass startled the men inside. Instinctively, The driver swerved, overcorrected, and collided with the edge of the pothole harder than expected. The van's balance shifted. Wheels spun. Metal groaned. The vehicle skidded sideways, crashed into a low barrier, and came to a jolting stop. In the chaos, Davil disappeared back into the shadows before anyone could exit fully and search the area. He had no intention of engaging them directly. The city would take care of the rest. Witnesses calling authorities, wrecker crews arriving, delays piling up. The crates inside the van might survive the crash, but the schedule would not. Deliveries would be late. Clients would be angry. Questions would be raised. A simple road accident on the surface, but from Davil's perspective, it was another pressure mark on a system already stretched by greed and carelessness. Small disruptions, repeated often enough, created fractures. These early actions were not about satisfaction. There was no joy in watching men fall or hearing about shipments gone wrong. There was only a cold, tactical observation of results. Each event added weight to the invisible hand Davil was placing on Marcus's operations. Each loss, however minor, would echo through layers of command. Davil also knew he could not remain entirely detached from his own morality. The path of revenge was a sharp one, and it would be easy to slip into senseless brutality. The forest had taught him discipline, not just a body but of intention. Every move now had to serve a purpose. Every risk taken had to bring him closer to Marcus, not simply sink him deeper into darkness. At night, when the city quieted and the sounds of traffic dulled, Davil sat alone in derelict rooms and reconstructed his plans. He would visualize Marcus's empire as a web, and then mentally cut through its threads, one after another. He imagined routes blocked, money disappearing, weapons getting lost, allies turning uncertain. He pictured Marcus's confidence slowly eroding, leaving paranoia in its place. He knew that once paranoia took hold, Marcus would start making mistakes. The first weeks of this silent campaign were like placing invisible cracks in a wall. Regular payments went missing from the same district more than once. Vehicles were damaged or delayed in ways that seemed unrelated but gradually formed a pattern. Low-level men complained. Supervisors scolded them. Rumors quietly spread that someone was targeting the gang from the shadows. Still, no one spoke Davil Sirate's name. The ghost of his memory remained buried under assumptions of his death. From a rooftop overlooking a section of Marcus's territory, Davil watched the restless movements of the gang one late evening. The men were more tense now. They scanned the streets more carefully. They argued with each other more often. The flow of activity, once confident and smooth, had become jagged. These were the first signs that his cuts were working. But Davil also understood something else. He was approaching a turning point. For now, he was attacking the edges, the money, the deliveries, the routines. Eventually, to bring Marcus down, he would have to step closer to the core. That step would be riskier than anything he had done so far. It would draw blood from higher levels. It would send real fear through the system. It would also announce that someone with intelligence and purpose was attacking them. The question was not whether he would take that step. The question was when. As the night wind brushed against his face and the city lights glowed faintly below, Davil Sirate made a silent, steady promise to himself. The time for small cuts would continue a little longer, but soon, very soon, the first deep wound would be delivered. Marcus Dre had destroyed his home in a single night. Davil would destroy Marcus's world piece by piece, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. The first cuts Davil Sirate made to Marcus Dre's empire were shallow, almost invisible to an untrained eye. Missing payments, delayed shipments, disrupted routes, confused men, nervous supervisors. These were symptoms of a system beginning to strain under quiet pressure. But a strained system was not a broken one. Davil knew that if he wanted Marcus to feel fear, real, suffocating fear, he would have to strike deeper. Not at the edges, at the heart. For weeks he had watched Marcus's operation tighten around itself. Guards doubled their shifts. Vehicles traveled in groups. Movement patterns became more erratic. The men no longer loitered with arrogance. They moved with suspicion, scanning corners and shadows, questioning every unexpected noise. They didn't yet know who they were fighting. They only knew someone had declared war. That ignorance was Davil's greatest weapon, and the time to use it had arrived. The core of Marcus's power was located in an old shipping compound near the river, a cluster of large warehouses, fenced off with rusted metal, but fortified on the inside like a fortress. It was here that money was counted, weapons stored, shipments scheduled, and major decisions made. It was also where Marcus spent most of his nights, surrounded by his closest men, confident that no one would dare come close. Davil had spent enough nights watching the compound from rooftops and abandoned containers to understand every opening, every guard rotation, and every blind spot the gang didn't know they had. The compound was strong, but strength often made men careless. On a night when the sky was heavy with drifting clouds and the moon was hidden behind a silver haze, Davil decided the moment had finally come. He approached the compound from the riverside, where the docks were quiet and mostly unused. Broken crates sat in piles. Old machinery rusted beside the water. Rats scurried across wooden planks. It was the perfect place for shadows to move unseen. Davil moved like a whisper, his steps calculated, his body steady and shaped by weeks of disciplined preparation. The fence surrounding the compound was tall but old. Davil had already discovered a weak section days earlier, hidden behind a stack of forgotten metal drums. With slow, steady pressure, he pried the metal aside just enough to slip through. Inside, the compound stretched in dim shapes, warehouses like sleeping giants, narrow lanes between them glowing under aging lights. Davil crouched behind a forklift, studying the movement of guards. They walked in pairs, crossing paths every few minutes. Their routine had tightened, but routines always contained openings. When the nearest pair turned a corner, Davil moved forward, staying low and close to shadows. He reached the backside of the largest warehouse, the one he knew Marcus used as a central base. A metal door stood at the far end, guarded by a single man. Overconfident, stationary, alone, Davil didn't rush. He waited until the guard shifted his stance, tiredness making his posture lazy. Then he moved in absolute silence, approaching from behind stacks of crates. The encounter was quick, clean, and quiet. The guard collapsed without alerting anyone. Davil dragged the body into a darker corner where it would remain unseen. The door was unlocked, another sign of Marcus's belief in his own invulnerability. Inside the warehouse, the space was vast and dim, illuminated by scattered lamps. Stacks of crates formed aisles. Tables were covered in paperwork, cash bundles, and equipment. The smell of oil and dust hung thick in the air. Footsteps echoed from distant corners, suggesting movement but not concentration. Davil moved through the aisles like a hunter. Every step brought him closer to the core. His heart did not race. It remained steady, shaped by discipline and purpose. The forest had taught him to control every breath, every shift of muscle. He was no longer chasing vengeance with rage. He was executing justice with precision. He found Marcus in the far section of the warehouse. The man sat at a long metal table with several lieutenants nearby, reviewing maps and ledgers. Even from a distance, Marcus wielded the same arrogant energy Davil remembered, the same belief that he had risen above consequences. The warehouse lights cast long shadows across his face, making him appear even more entrenched in his own power. Davil watched from behind a stack of crates, analyzing the scene. There were too many men to attack directly with brute force. But brute force had never been Davil's approach. Strategy, misdirection, and pressure, these were his weapons. He noticed something critical. Several fuel containers were stacked against the far wall, next to a cluster of electrical cables running from a power box. A weakness, a vulnerability the gang had overlooked in their arrogance. Davil moved toward the opposite end of the warehouse where a panel of old machinery sat idle. He found a heavy wrench lying beside it, cold metal, solid weight. He gripped it and glanced at the cables again. A simple spark would ignite the fuel. A strategically placed fire would cut off exits, create chaos, and isolate Marcus from his strongest men. He did not hesitate. With a silent calculation, he hurled a wrench at the junction of cables. The impact was sharp and sudden. Sparks burst like a scatter of stars, landing on the stacked fuel cans. A second later, fire erupted, first a flicker, then a violent bloom of orange heat that spread across the wall. Shouts filled the warehouse almost instantly. Marcus's men scattered, some rushing toward the flames with panic, others reaching for weapons, unsure of what had happened. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Davil slipped deeper into the maze of crates as chaos grew. Flames climbed rapidly, consuming walls, beams, and everything in their path. The warehouse groaned under the pressure of rising heat. Men coughed, stumbled, and yelled orders that no one could follow clearly. Confusion reigned. Marcus stood at the center, his confidence cracking as he tried to regain control. His face twisted with alarm, scanning the surroundings for an explanation. He did not yet see Davil, but he felt him. Davil knew the moment had come. The chaos he created would isolate Marcus, cornering him not with brute strength, but with intelligence. Through the smoke, he moved closer, unnoticed in the frantic movements around him. He reached the final row of crates, just meters away from Marcus. Flames roared against the walls, eating away at the warehouse's structure. The floor trembled under the heat. The air shimmered. This was where Marcus had destroyed Davil's world, inside a burning structure filled with screams and collapse. Now Davil had returned the moment to him. Marcus finally sensed a presence behind him. He turned, and in the shifting glow of fire, he saw something that shattered the lie he had believed. Davil Sirate was alive. The look on Marcus's face, shock mixed with fear, was not something Davil savored. He did not need satisfaction. He needed completion. Without saying a word, without even a hint of hesitation, he stepped forward. What followed was not a dramatic clash. It was swift, decisive, and devastating. Marcus fought like a cornered animal, driven by panic rather than skill. Davil fought like a man shaped by the forest, by loss, by survival. In the end, the outcome was inevitable. Marcus fell. His empire fell with him. As the warehouse collapsed around them, Davil walked away through smoke and chaos, leaving behind the ruins of the man who had destroyed his life. Outside, distant sirens echoed. The night wind carried embers across the water. The city felt different, lighter, as if exhaling after years of pressure. Davil did not look back. His vengeance was complete, but he did not search for celebration. There was nothing left to claim in the ruins of a dead empire. He walked toward the river, toward the shadows that welcomed him, understanding that he would never be the man he once had been. But he was alive. He was reborn. And Eastbridge City would whisper his name forever. Not as a boss, not as a ghost, but as a storm that returned from the trees and reshaped the world in silence.